Welcome everyone today. My name is Susan Patrick. I'm the President and CEO of iNACL and co-founder of Competency Works with Chris Sturgis from Medisnet. I'm in Virginia today. Chris Sturgis is joining us from New Mexico in lovely Santa Fe. They are having windstorms, so we are watching Chris's connection here into the webinar, and we have her on the line too using the phone. So join me in welcoming Chris, thanking all of you for participating today. I want to welcome everyone to the webinar. Before we get started, I just want to point out that we have a chat room in the lower left-hand corner where everyone who's involved is introducing themselves, where they're from, and their interest or their work in competency-based education. Please feel free to introduce yourself now and use the chat feature to generate questions you might have throughout the webinar. We will have time to pause and check for questions and answers at several points throughout this webinar. So let's begin. Today's webinar is an overview of K-12 competency-based education across the United States, and it's geared for education leaders and also for educators. The learning goals today are to explore the definition of what is competency-based education and what isn't it. We're going to look at the relationship between competency-based education, personalized learning, and blended learning. We're going to look at how competency-based education state policy is advancing around the U.S. and the opportunities in the Every Student Succeeds Act and federal policy. And at the end, we will check our understanding of competency-based learning, how it's developing, lessons learned, and emerging issues. Chris, thank you for your leadership at Competency Works and all of the incredible writing in these reports and blogs. I will turn over to you to begin.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everybody. Okay, so my job is to start us off to really take some time to think about what is the problem with the traditional system and why do we have to change it. So if we're going to start to think about competency-based education, we're finding helps so much to understand how the traditional system actually is designed for sorting. Susan, could you move my page? Oh, maybe I could do it myself. I'm connected. Whoops. There we go. So the traditional system. So first of all, it's based on a fixed mindset. And the more I think about this, the more I'm just amazed by this. Because the idea of a fixed mindset, of course, is we can't change our intelligence in any way. So essentially, we think about some kids are smart and some aren't so smart. And we just assume that. So guess what the implications of that really starts to be? What we're realizing is that teachers and schools didn't actually feel like they could do very much for kids. And so their own efficacy was diminished and their own sense of accountability is diminished with a fixed mindset. Now, I had no idea how profound this is. So that's one of the huge big changes. And of course, we're all trying to figure out if we're going to build on a growth mindset, what does that really mean? The second quality of a traditional system that leads to sorting is that it's time-based. And of course, you've probably heard about this, of course, which is kids move on based on their age, right? So we just move up in our grade, 4th grade to 5th grade, whether or not we actually learned everything we were supposed to have learned. So what happens, we get kids going into middle school, even into high school, who might have elementary school skills because nobody really took that accountability to make sure they learned, because guess what? We didn't really think they could learn that much because we had a fixed mindset. So we have this whole process of passing kids on with B's and D's and with gaps in their skills. And that, we all know, is just creates so much demand for differentiation in the traditional classroom. So teachers start teaching to the middle. So then the next thing, of course, is those grading systems, that A through F grading system. And there's a lot of issues related to grading. But one of the main ones is it really depends on an extrinsic motivation. And so we're basically saying, okay, kids, we want you to act in certain ways, and you have to do it with, we're going to give you points for that, right? And not only we're going to mix the academics and the behaviors, so you don't even really know what that B means, because you might have gotten a lot of points for good behavior. And so that extrinsic motivation works really good if you're the winners, right? You're the top 10, 20% of your class. You will like those points. It makes you feel good. That rest of the 80% really aren't compelled by that. So what does that mean for competency-based education? We're really thinking about how do we build intrinsic motivation so that every student is motivated. Now, we go to the fourth quality. Teachers work in a lot of isolation in the traditional system. And what's been happening is there's high variability in how teachers determine proficiency. And quite honestly, there's a high variability in how schools determine proficiency, so that we have, as we know, some schools teaching fourth graders, fourth grade curriculum, but others have slipped down and said to say, oh no, we're going to teach them kind of more of a second grade curriculum. And of course, that's how the No Child Left Behind started to really push us towards, no, everybody should be working on the same grade level. But this issue about this variability is tough, and we've all, think back to your own childhood. There are some really easy teachers, right, and those hard teachers. Those hard teachers actually had higher expectations for us about proficiency. And then the last one is that the traditional system deeply values efficiency. It values it much more than effectiveness. And so it's organized around how do we efficiently deliver the curriculum to a group of kids that we actually don't think we could help get smarter. Some of them are going to learn it and some of them aren't. And so you can see that the traditional system just keeps reinforcing this idea that it's the only thing we can do is pass the kids on because we can't actually help them. So now Susan is going to take us through what competency-based education is.
Thanks, Chris. So let's pivot here. Let's really dive in. When Chris and I started working together in 2009 and 2010, we found that people across the field of K-12 and even higher ed were talking past each other in terms of, what do you mean by competency-based education? Does it mean you just advance when you're ready? Like, okay, if we know these things are big issues holding students back in the traditional system, how do we envision a new system that is designed so that every student gets what they need every step of the way? So we worked in 2010 and 2011 with a group of 100 innovators across the U.S., practitioners, educators working on competency-based education, and developed this 5-part definition. And all 5 parts are really important as design elements to what we mean when we're saying a competency-based education system. So number 1, we're talking about students are advancing upon demonstrating mastery. You might hear it called performance-based learning or proficiency-based learning or mastery-based learning. The idea is all the same, which is students must demonstrate their knowledge and mastery of learning through a performance with some evidence in order to advance to the next level. And what that means is that you don't allow kids to move along based on time with big gaps in their learning, that they are building those skills, knowledge, and abilities every step of the way for a solid foundation. Number 2, that the competencies, the learning goals are explicit, they're measurable, they're transferable learning objectives, and they empower students. Students own their learning. Number 3 is that assessment is a meaningful process and a positive learning experience for students. Did you get it? Did you get part of it? Do you understand it? Or have you demonstrated it? Students are working and they're building their own knowledge and skills and are empowered to understand what they've learned and what's next. 4th, when students aren't quite there yet in proficiency, they are getting immediate support based on their own needs. And number 5, this is critical. The learning outcomes are broader than just academic knowledge. It's about the application and creation of knowledge, habits, important skills, and dispositions. So when we look at understanding this competency-based system and the structures that ensure students have mastery, we hear people across the field working on new learning models, using these terms interchangeably, and it's creating a lot of confusion and also affecting how we think about quality implementation. So let me explore for just a moment how these concepts are related and where they intersect. So they don't mean the same thing. What is different about them? We think about competency-based education as a systemic structure ensuring mastery. Number two, when you look at personalizing learning, that's an approach to ensure that each student has the pathways, you're meeting them where they are, they're getting what they need, and they're able to build on their interests. I'm going to go a little deeper into that in the next slide. So blended learning, that's a delivery model. Blended and online learning, it's really hard to personalize learning for each student in a competency-based structure without having the tools. So teachers with tools, such as blended learning, help give you information about where every student is, help expand access to the resources. So competency-based education structure, personalized learning approaches for better personalization of the learning experience, and blended learning as an engine or delivery model. So here is the definition that iNACOL developed in 2013 in our report, Mean What You Say, defining and integrating personalized, blended, and competency education. Personalizing learning is tailoring learning for each student's strengths, needs, and interests. So it's enabling kids voice and choice in what, how, when, and where they learn. You're holding all students to the same high expectations, the same high standards, but you're providing flexibility, and it's key to provide the supports to ensure mastery for each student. So think about personalization as per person, per student, figuring out how they're reaching those skills, standards, and goals, but they're able to do it in ways that are really tied into their own interest and passion. So you might have students decide, I'm really interested in alternative energy. I'm going to learn some of my science standards and math standards by doing a project and fieldwork with a smaller group of students. And you may have another group of students in the class who want to learn another way. But the idea that you're opening up the potential and inspiring students with powerful personalized learning. So blended learning, again, is a delivery system. As Michael Horn and Heather Staker define it with this three-part definition, the key is that students are able to have some different choices in their delivery models, whether it's using a textbook, online learning, or blended learning. But the delivery of blended learning helps support this personalization. It often supports the student control over pace and path. It helps teachers monitor and create additional resources. And the key is that it's connected and integrated. So competency-based education is the foundation. Personalized learning are approaches and the goal towards personalization. And blended learning we see as an engine. So let's take a look at what it might look like. All students in this classroom in the school are being held to the same high standards and expectations. The students are working on their own projects. They're figuring out how they're building their skills and knowledge that will work towards that common goal, that common solution.
Oh, you don't think so?
Well,
there's some background noise. If you're on the phone, please put it on mute. Hello? If you're on the phone, please put it on mute. Thanks. So here is another example. Here students each have a learner profile, and the teachers are able to tell exactly where they are in their math learning progressions. Students may be in small groups. Some of them are getting peer-to-peer instruction, but every student in this modern math classroom, or this lab, learning lab, is focused on the learning targets that they need to stay on track. It's all about advancing on mastery, building those competencies, getting the supports immediately, every day, on what they need, and moving on when they're ready. So this comes from the work in Oregon, across the state in Oregon, on proficiency-based learning. They talk about competency-based learning is fundamental to personalizing learning at scale, and it challenges almost all of our assumptions about the present system. As Chris stated in the beginning, What about grading? Why do we allow students to move on with C's and D's when they have these huge gaps? What does this mean for our schedules if we need more flexibility to give the supports that we need, and on and on. So when we put these ideas together, it really is about personalized learning approaches for each and every student with a competency-based system focused on these innovations for equity. So we need to be really clear about the competencies. The competency-based structure gives us the transparency on where students are in their continuum. It gives us consistency, and it gives us, quite frankly, much clearer accountability and transparency than we have in a traditional system with courses and 8F grading. So personalized learning approach really produces more equitable growth when we can see it on a shared set of high expectations. This is really a fundamental pedagogical shift. If you think about innovating pedagogy, and should be designed based on the research on the learning sciences for motivation and engagement and how kids learn best. That is where the real connection with personalized learning comes in. So we're taking advantage of technology to deliver instruction in ways that support kids and teachers, but this is not about the technology. It is about the design of the learning model in a competency-based and personalized structure. So some other things that you might see in schools that we visited that are competency-based, we're illustrating some concepts here, is that it's really important for students, this is from a primary school, an elementary school, to learn how to learn and to learn and own the language of learning and have that empowerment. So students are empowered with this language of learning how to learn, and they're building these skills, and this can be across disciplines. You're also focusing on social, emotional learning and well-being. Learning is visible. This is from the staircase from one of the high schools I visited. And the well-being, social, emotional skills are core to learning. Again, consistent with the learning sciences. Bigger goals related to college, to career opportunities. These schools, this is from a high school, each student is setting learning goals and the targets are clear. A key feature of effective pathways where students have personalized pathways is they allow learners to define the purpose for what they are doing. They need to be flexible. These competency-based pathways and personalized learning approaches don't lock kids down. It's really important that they don't lock kids down to one path and that students are able to access all of the pathways. You also see in these models, this is the same school, look at all of the data on every student's desk as they are driven by purpose, examining where they are in relation to their bigger goals, what competency, skills, and knowledge they've already built, where they need to go, and we're supporting learners in navigating across these informed choices with learning opportunities both inside of school and outside of school. The school is in the middle of the day and it looks like it's half empty because kids are in their communities, they're in internships, and they're learning in ways that are relevant and meaningful for them. So the goals are clearly articulated for the levels of progress across this K-12 continuum towards qualifications or a diploma, including the academic, the personal leadership skills, social emotional skills, even sports and other interests. And here we have students in the high school that are all engaged in different cross-disciplinary projects, attaining the knowledge, skills, and abilities they need. One student was working on an artificial intelligence literature review and project. They were going to look at the history of artificial intelligence, where it's going in the next 10 to 20 years, what the societal, ethical implications are of artificial intelligence, and the move for more robots. And the student was explaining to me the competencies towards graduation that they would be developing through this project, and it included science, math, language arts, and social studies. So this is really exciting work. You've seen a quick overview on what is competency-based education, what it looks like, what we mean when we say competency-based education systems and structures, what we mean by personalized learning. So we'd love to open it up for questions. I see Dr. Regalu there. Can you provide a list of schools that are doing competency-based education well? We sure can, and we can follow up and send that out. And also, we have a number of blogs on competencyworks.org where we highlight the work happening in schools. I think that would make a great blog topic to reflect on. So thank you for that question. Any other questions in the chat room? Thanks, Chris, for the link to the schools that are visited. Any states moving in this direction with good models?
We had
great question. In the next part of the webinar,
about special
we're going to explore.
And I just want to quickly mention it, and I'm going to try to find a blog about it as well. Special education is really interesting, so I ask at most of the school visits kind of how people, like what the implications are. And what I hear mostly is that it's competency-based education and a personalized approach are pretty much consistent with the ideas under special ed, which is that children need personalized approach. They need to be able to get the supports they need in order to be successful. They need plans. They need goal setting. And that resources need to be organized and wrapped around them in a way that allows them to make progress. And that transparency and explicitness has been very valuable. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is that some folks said that it's really been helpful in clarifying that an accommodation is about accommodating kids so that they can learn and demonstrate their learning. It is not changing the actual standards and expectations. And that something about making the entire system transparent has actually been able to create some consistency and coherency across special ed and the overall school program. We haven't heard, the only issue that I've heard that has been, it's not that anything is worse off for kids with disabilities in competency-based schools, but again, because of the transparency and the expectations, there are issues starting to emerge in Maine related to the proficiency-based diploma and what happens when kids aren't exactly ready at age 18 to graduate. They haven't demonstrated all that proficiency, and it's forcing a much richer conversation about that, and also about how do you make sure that kids get the extra help they need to get there, including possibly an extra year.
And Chris, we have a number of other questions that have come up while you've been talking that are really, really good, so I'm going to help facilitate this too. And to David Rankin, you have a great question on states moving in this direction with good models. That's actually the next section of the webinar, so hold on, we'll get there. Let me go to some of these other questions. Alex Dreyer asks, are you aware of any good research on the social emotional learning implications of students progressing at vastly different rates? For example, the emotional impact on a 15-year-old who is working alongside a majority of kids who are much younger than him or her. And I'll just start and then turn it over to Chris. I would start by saying in the classrooms that I have been in that are truly competency-based, the grade spans or the age span, students are with their peers. The age spans might be two years or so, but the way you organize the entire system, this is where we get to this, it challenges all of our assumptions. Like in our current classrooms, we're batching kids by age and to grade levels, and in the old highly qualified teacher law, you had to have one teacher teaching that one subject to that one group of kids in that one classroom. In a competency-based model, you are teaching students within their peer groups, getting that social, emotional, focus, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, and support. And they're working generally with students across 2 or so years, so they're not working with students that are dramatically different in age, but they are able to keep track of exactly where a student is. So there may be like different levels that students are working on, but if you're tracking it, if you're keeping track of the data and the transparency and making sure that students stay on pace, it's not that time doesn't matter, but we're focusing a lot more on pace and giving kids more time when they need it. And then once they get it, we're accelerating them so we're keeping them within this age range. Chris, did you want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, so I'm going to repeat this because I think it's so important. Some people hear competency-based education and assume that we're throwing out organizing schools by grade level. But there are lots of reasons to have kids working together either in or near their age grade. And one is, at Casco Bay, they're very clear they want a cohort of learners that work with each other and support each other through school. So that's one reason. Another is developmentally. We look at kids much more holistically in the personalized competency-based way. So there are choices about that, and there is definitely some shifting, but it does not necessarily mean we're going to now batch everybody based on their performance levels. The other thing, I think, going back to this fixed mindset versus growth mindset, what I hear in the classrooms when I talk to folks and kids is under a fixed mindset, if you're not one of those top 20%, you feel kind of dumb, right? I mean, and you start to disengage. By the time you're 12, you're like, I can't do anything. I'm having to sit here now through high school. In the growth mindset, especially when you have support, you can set your own goals, there's actually a fair amount of pride in your own growth, and there's less negative there's not as much embarrassment if you happen to be working at a different performance level, because you might be at grade level or above in reading, but be 2 grade levels behind in math, and that's okay because you're making progress and you can be proud of that progress. So, and this is good. What's the next question, Susan?
So, Chris, we have some really good ones, and we try to get through these kind of quickly, but can you recommend top blended learning platforms that support personalized learning with competency-based education most effectively? How does Summit Learning Platform rate? Chris, do you want me to?
Yeah, why don't you start and I'll add something at the end.
Sure. So this is definitely one of the big challenges that we'll raise as an emerging issue at the end. The platforms are designed for the traditional model. However, with that said, for the schools that are doing competency-based education, there are a few platforms. They're not exactly perfect right now, but I would say Summit Learning Basecamp is one of the best that's out there to support personalizing learning and competency-based because it was designed just for that purpose. They are still working with cohorts of districts across the U.S. and cohorts of schools to improve the functionality and meet the functional requirements of the competency system, but it was designed for that purpose. Lindsay, California, which is a competency-based district that has been doing really great work for years, and several other of the districts across Maine and New Hampshire use Empower. So there are a few, and we don't refer to them as blended learning platforms, but more as information management systems or integrated learning management systems. Chris, did you want to just comment on the platforms question?
Yeah. I mean, really, so the way this question is raised, I just want to make a distinction here. You're talking about blended learning platforms, right? That are supported blended learning. And again, that's a delivery system. And what we need in competency-based systems is a way of being able to track student progress that actually shows progress over time, over years, and that you can get a picture of student growth not just in one course, but in all their courses. And all the domains so that you really get a picture of how a student is growing and what you can learn from that. That's really a set of information about tracking progress. It's really important for everybody. Just asking providers whether they do that, and there's a great document that Nicole has done. I bet Natalie's looking for it right now, by Liz Gloa and some other folks, that really identifies what we need for an information system in competency-based systems. And I would, every time you talk to a vendor about student information systems, blended learning, all those things, send them this report and say, can you do these things? Because we need to put pressure on the vendors to produce what we need.
Yeah, we'll put the link to the report. It's student-centered learning and optimizing information systems to help with competency-based education. We will put that in the link. Chris, I know we're at time for questions, but there are a couple good questions here. Do you find that all students are successful in this model? How do you deal with a student who just doesn't want to progress or work?
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so there's a number of skills and areas of work that are very explicit in the competency-based system. So let me just back this off a little bit. So one of the things about grading that's pretty much a non-negotiable is you separate out the academic learning from the behaviors. And we've always just kind of called that the behaviors. But what's really that set of behaviors that lead to students being successful in school? Well, we really have a much deeper understanding about this. And schools are what we've discovered is, this is a lesson learned, is that it's really important to pay attention to this in your first year of transition. Like, don't put this off. So let's talk about those set of skills. One is having a growth mindset. And you don't get a growth mindset and always have it, right? It's something that goes back and forth, but you learn to manage your way of thinking. So students begin to hear their inner voice, being able to change their inner voice. I can do this, I can't do this. What will it take for me to be successful? Who can I ask for help? That inner voice, that has a lot to do with how kids engage in their learning. So that's getting to one of the issues that might be underlying a student kind of being resistant to learning. Another one is all the efforts around student agency, and that requires a whole bunch of skills, and it also requires the schools and the classroom to structure themselves, but kids start to have more responsibility for their learning. So it's no longer just on the responsibility of the teacher to get that kid to learn. You engage in a conversation about what's going to make a difference for you. And if it's really that the only way I'm going to engage in this is if I can read about cars, do things about cars is my passion, well, maybe that's what we need to do for the short run to be able to engage this kid. Another part of this is, of course, all the social emotional skills. And so there's a piece, I'll go find the blog, around District 51 who's making the transition right now to competency-based education, and they are investing so much energy in helping develop these qualities. We call them the lifelong learning skills. It's a whole package of skills that you start with kindergarten, right, but you can learn it at any point. But it's really seeing these as opportunities. When the kid's behavior isn't what we want it to be, it's an opportunity to engage with them and learn and help them reflect on their own mindsets about going forward. Susan?
Yeah, so we have so many great questions. What I'm going to suggest is I'm keeping an eye on these questions. We're going to go through the state policy piece pretty quickly, and then we have more time at the end to keep digging in with the questions. If that's okay with everyone, we will come back to them because they're really terrific. So let me just go ahead from here and say, let's take a look at some key ideas on overview of competency-based education and state policy. So when Chris and I began the literature review in this work in 2010, there were about a handful of states that were starting to move on and advance with state policy flexibility to enable competency-based learning. By 2012, which is this slide, there were about 20 states. That's a pretty significant jump from 2010 to 2012, By 2016, you've got more than 40 states that are working out this creating enabling policy for flexibility in competency-based education. And we just got this map done yesterday. And if you have any information about Wyoming, California, or these states, please feel free to email us at spatrick@inacle.com. In 2017, you have almost all states creating or have created enabling policy. We have states that are more advanced in red that are building more comprehensive policy across their system and working to build capacity in local systems. You have states that are developing, and I will go into some specifics in just a minute on what this looks like in emerging states and developing states. So here is the key. We have now, with the passage of the new federal law in December 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act, power shifted back to states. So here are some core things that states are thinking about with regard to competency-based education. There is the opportunity for new definitions of student success, to rethink accountability systems and rethink what a next generation accountability system might look like, new systems of assessment, and the highly qualified teacher provisions are gone. So first, it's really important to begin and end when we're thinking about competency-based education systems with the outcomes, the end in mind. What do we want our students to know and be able to do? Anybody who was frustrated with the limited definition of student success and No Child Left Behind now has the opportunity. Feels like the conversations were frozen under NCLB because it was set for you. But now the time has come. It's time to engage communities in deep conversations about what our hopes and goals are for a profile as a graduate. With this move, we can newly define what student success looks like for skills, competency, knowledge, habits. So you want to engage localities, districts, schools, communities around what students need to know and be able to do and have those conversations with your state and the development of plans. It also asks, once you do that and have this new definition of success, how do you think about this? What does that mean for accountability? And in the new federal law, you are allowed to have multiple measures. And the focus has moved from compliance on the law to how do we develop systems in states working with districts and schools around continuous improvement. And the great news is that even when a state submits their state plan, there's opportunities for amendments from year to year to really build and change. So we've got to be engaging in these conversations around definitions of student success and around what those measures would look like. What does the state need to know? What does the school leader need to know? What does the community need to know? What does the district need to know? And what does that mean for each level of accountability? It doesn't necessarily mean that the state needs to own all of the data or have that in their system, but it means we need to start thinking about ideas of mutual accountability and who needs what data and being more transparent and more focused on equity and continuous improvement than we ever have. The other great thing the new federal law gives the power to the states to rethink about assessments and systems, plural, of assessments, plural. So these systems of assessment should be about, the law says, assessments for and of learning, so that it is empowering teachers with the data that they need to meet individual learning needs, and that we are focused on the application of knowledge and important skills of disposition. So performance assessments, different forms of evidence. And this new model really decouples these. Accountability and assessment are two different ideas. So what does it mean to be accountable and to do what's right and to focus on equity? And then how are we going to use different models of assessments that are appropriate to determine student progress on the mastery of standards and these objectives with the skills. So the law allows you to be able to use combinations of assessments, including formative assessments, performance assessments, and performance tasks, as well as adaptive items to identify where students are coming in and to be able to meet their needs. There is also in the federal law a really interesting opportunity. If you as a state have a group of districts, but it's not statewide, but you have a group or subset of districts that are ready to move forward with competency-based education, there is a provision in the law called the Innovative Assessment Pilot to support competency-based education for a subset of these districts or schools to begin innovating new competency-based models for accountability and new models of assessments to build state capacity. Lastly, yes, highly qualified teacher, that provision is gone. It's in the domain of states, and states now have the opportunity to think about credentials for adults that may be competency-based as well. That's starting to happen. Can these competency-based systems also support our adult learners with personalized pathways? So how do we have the skills to lead and teach in competency-based systems? There are some districts and some states looking at micro-credentials and badging, breaking apart what teachers, what educators need to know and be able to do, and to build capacity using competency-based systems, micro-credentials. And this is really interesting, exciting work. So INACOL published a paper. It's called Meeting Essence Promise, State Policy to Support Personalized Learning, which we just walked through. There's way more information in there. And so when you go back to those maps I showed you at the beginning, here's what states are doing to advance competency-based education. Virginia is working on a Profile to Graduate initiative where they develop broader new definitions of student success. I encourage you to check it out. We have it on our blog. It's in the report. In Maine, they're working on proficiency-based diplomas, and several other states. There are pilots for competency-based education taking hold in Ohio and other states. States are hosting task forces to be able to bring together different stakeholders and identify next steps, what they need to do, where they want to engage in competency-based education. Iowa did this when they got started. And there are states creating innovation zones so the districts can begin to innovate, identify and flag state policy barriers, and the state has a commitment to removing those barriers so that we can move from this compliance mindset to supporting innovations in competency-based education. And perhaps the state that has been working on this the longest, over 2 decades, is New Hampshire. And they are doing incredible work in building capacity for educators and building capacity for assessments for learning, performance-based assessments to support competency-based education in their PACE project, and new models of accountability. So when we think about states taking a comprehensive approach, you can take a look at New Hampshire and the amazing work that they're doing. So here is a copy of the report, and I'd be happy to take any questions. The report has very much more information, specific recommendations for state policymakers, and presents a comprehensive overview on how state policy can support student-centered learning. So, additional questions on policy, or I can go back to our earlier questions.
Susan, there's a big question, which I'm trying to find. Jeff, where's your question? Jeff with Liberty and other people would like a question answered about the relationship between personalization and competency-based ed. Here's the question. To what extent do you believe that personalization is dependent upon committing to competency-based education? Is it your position that a commitment to personalization without a commitment to CBE is inadequate? He's interested in this subject because the vast majority of schools are light years away from CBE, but it is possible to make significant gains with respect to personalization in non-CBE environments.
Great question. Yeah, so the way I would
I know, we talk about this all the time. So why don't you go ahead and then I'll add on.
Sure. So I'll try to be quick because I really could talk about this in depth. One is there are different entry points for different schools, and I think there can be a lot of judginess on where the entry points are, and I think we need to really be careful about that. But what is really important is that there is an overarching goal towards a broader move to make sure that we are creating learning environments that will support all students to be successful. And I do believe that a competency-based structure is absolutely critical to that really big goal of transformation around doing what's right for every single student and protecting equity. With that said, okay, the difference between personalized learning and competency-based education, and do you really need a competency-based system for personalizing learning? The answer is you can take personalized learning approaches without having it on a competency-based, you could, structure, but if you are focused on equity, we believe that it's absolutely critical for personalized learning to be built on competency-based progressions and competency-based structures in order to ensure that every student is getting what they need in the support and exhibiting high levels of mastery. Because too often, personalized learning without a competency-based structure will result in flexible pacing that may have variable outcomes that may not ensure that students are actually demonstrating that mastery. So the answer is it's possible, and that is a common entry point, but I think that educators that are really dedicated towards equity and ensuring every student's success with that broader range of knowledge, skills, and abilities are understanding that we must hinge personalized learning into a competency-based structure in order to protect equity. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, that's totally right. One of the things, so there's lots of different understandings about what competency-based ed is, and there's lots of different understandings about personalized learning. Okay, whoever is talking and laughing, can you hear us? Can you mute? No, they're talking. So we'll keep going. So I think one of the things is you have to be very clear about what the changes are that you're doing. So then in personalized learning schools, some of them talk about competency-based progressions, and they're actually often talking about online learning. And online learning is not competency-based education in our mind. It is online learning, and it is a delivery mechanism. So part of this is really understanding this relationship. The other thing about competency ed, the transparency seems to be actually transformational. Over and over again, what I hear from teachers is that transparency both increases and improves the intentionality of teachers and teaching, as well as empowering kids to take much more responsibility and feel that the system is much fairer. And so, which is a really important part of learning, is to feel that it's fair and that people are behind you and not judging you. So I think we have to still keep unpacking how the relationship between personalized learning and competency-based ed is, to understand the places that are most important to get right. All I can say is we need to keep unpacking and keep exploring this. And there's another really good question, Susan. Right, there are, I'm sure, lots, but this is a great one, and I'm going to just jump into it. Rebecca Howe asked if this clearly can work beautifully for non-traditional schools, charter, special focus schools, but what about traditional on-site school districts? Using personalized learning across the curriculum, across grades. It seems more challenging to implement with a traditional building. So one of the most wonderful things about competency-based education is that it appears to be an entire district reform model that can be done, because we're seeing district after district after district do it. Entire states are changing their districts towards the competency-based model. And so the fact that it's viable and doable by the whole district is an incredible opportunity for us. Now, we need to make sure that it's high quality, We need to understand how to actually make sure it's done as well as it possibly can be, because it's possible to have poor implementation of competency-based ed for sure. But it is definitely a model that is being done. And what I want to say is at Parker Varney Elementary School in New Hampshire, I just heard about this. They're getting great results, and we're going to put this on a blog very quickly on competency work. But they went to multi-age. They're much more differentiated than they were. They're very project-based learning. Kids are very actively, a lot of student agency. And this is a school with a high, low-income community, lots of different home languages, and they have made this change, and I think in about 3 years. So it can definitely be done in the traditional schools. You can see more innovative models, I think, in some of the standalone schools, be they charters or small schools that aren't, that have, and if they're small, I think also, and teachers can talk to each other more frequently and easily. I think some more innovative models are being seen there that can inform the rest of us.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We have a bunch of, I think that was a great response. We have a bunch of other questions too. Did you want to go to your last two slides and then we'll just start going through the questions with the rest of our time? Yeah, I'll go through them quickly, and so we can stop and talk some more. So here's a couple things. So as Susan mentioned, I spend a lot of time visiting schools and districts, and this is some of the variations and some of the issues that are coming up. So which skills are schools focusing, and how do they relate them to each other? So we've talked about this importance of lifelong learning skills, the habits of work, the social, emotional, and what people are really starting to understand is that those skills are what is needed for students to be successful in the academics and higher order skills. And so making this connection and understanding essentially a theory of action or a pedagogical strategy is what it really is putting more and more emphasis in the schools on these lifelong learning skills. The other thing we're hearing is shifts in how much schools are focusing on content and how much they're focusing on skills. And this is particularly important at the high school level, where a lot of the classes have been traditionally covering content at levels of memory and comprehension. And what we're seeing and I'm hearing is that schools describe themselves as moving from 80% content to 20% skills to about 50-50. And then there's models like the Young Women's Leadership School that's actually totally driven by 10 higher order skills, and content becomes the way you learn and engage in those higher order skills. So that's very interesting to watch and see if we're moving in that trend or not. Another one's around organizing around age and skills. We've talked about that already, so I'm going to jump through it. Applied learning. For those schools that did not clarify their pedagogy first, what we're seeing is as they make this change to competency ed, they start to realize, oh my gosh, we don't have enough opportunity for applied learning opportunities. And applied learning both is the way to engage kids, but it's also giving them a chance to demonstrate their skills at higher levels or deeper levels of knowledge, however you want to talk about that. So we're seeing more people pay attention to applied learning. We're seeing a lot more discussion around meeting students where they are. It is very challenging with the state accountability exams because teachers feel it's only fair, they say. It's only fair to cover the curriculum, to cover the standards that they're going to be tested on. But that's a trade-off on the other only fair, which is to make sure kids have the prerequisite skills they need in order to do those standards. And so that tension is building up across the country in the competency-based school. Issues around how we measure growth and the grading practices are going to be, there's a lot of variations on this, and I think we're going to see more and more tension around it because there's a lot of hybrid grading practices that are being developed. And I'm not sure that people are really getting everything they want out of that. They're scared to go all the way to only scoring kids on their progress. They keep different pieces of the old grading systems, but to what end? And what is the message we're really sending to kids when we do that? And then we're
seeing and hearing more discussions around internal accountability. How do we build accountability into the districts and schools? Rather than having it be seen as something that is external, how do we as a school and a district actually shift our resources around as we need to make sure that we're being effective? The implementation, we kind of talked about it when a district moves to competency-based ed as their first step. Like, they haven't really started to personalize yet, right? So they're just going, okay, we're going to become competency-based. They tend to do it in these 4 stages of ramping up, which is really about engaging their community and creating a broader sense of what they want for their kids, what student success is. And they often have teachers actually vote to move forward, which seems to be a really important step. They design their infrastructure, and they can get caught in that process. And so it's really important to do your best job and keep moving. Then they make the transition, and they start to deal with these issues about how do we provide enough support. Oh my gosh, we need to do more lifelong learning supports, and they start to think about pacing and much more strategically. And finally, when they have kind of gotten to about year 3, they go into this effort of continuous improvement, as I said, starting to think more about their pedagogy and the applied learning. But what we're learning from this is anytime a school wants to try to pilot something, it's really important to get the commitment from the school board first. Piloting with just a few teachers, if you haven't made the commitment, is probably unlikely to get you where you want to go, partially because competency-based ed, at the least, is a whole school-wide model. And we really recommend it as a district-wide model. What we're also seeing is those schools that take some time to actually think, what do we really believe about how kids learn and what's the best ways of teaching? When they clarify their pedagogical principles up front, everything is much easier. And implementing blended learning is much easier. Implementing competency-based ed is much easier. Implementing personalized learning is much easier. So it ends up that being sure that we actually you're clear about what your beliefs are about how kids learn really makes a difference. We're starting to hear and see a lot of different schools that started with either blended learning or personalized learning start to move towards competency ed. So we've got a whole nother cycle of learning about that and trying to identify what's really going on with those schools and are there certain lessons to be learned and stages of implementation. And the other thing we're hearing lots about is once schools start to become personalized, once they start to be competency-based, they start to say, well, we've got to treat the adults in the system the same way, which is, of course, true. And so then they start to think about how do we create professional learning that draws on the assets of our teachers, draws on the assets of our professional learning communities, and then how do we really begin to make sure that the professional learning is job embedded, it's really relating to what the needs are in terms of how do we help our kids. And it's really pretty amazing, and I think we're going to start to see more and more models about this, and we're just starting to hear about teacher prep programs starting to think about what does it mean to be preparing teachers for personalized competency-based systems. And then the last thing, quickly, emerging issues. So you probably, if you've been reading competencyworks.org, we're having another national summit. We had one 6 years ago where we created the working definition. We've identified 4 issues that we think are just critical for the field to be able to advance. One is, what does equity mean, and how do we ensure that we are doing the very best we can to eliminate inequitable practices in personalized competency-based schools. As I mentioned before, meeting students where they are, we've got to get a grip on this. Another one is, can we really start to define what a quality personalized competency-based system looks like before we have research on that? We really need to be able to draw on our practitioner knowledge to be able to make this easier to do and help districts and schools make the transition to know when they've got poor implementation or high quality implementation. And then we're really starting to think about frameworks that are going to help us to build the policies we need, not to just make the change to competency-based ed, but to support it so that we have a sustainable system. Other critical issues that are jumping around, and this is just a few of them, The issue we talked about earlier, the need for integrated information systems that are really designed around student learning, the intersection with higher education, teacher pre-service and professional learning, assessment literacy. It's a big one. Building the capacity around assessment is something every district that moves towards competency-based education eventually starts to do. The power of student agency, I think we're just at the beginning of understanding the implications of what this means for our schools. And then the communication and community engagement, as it's expanding, there's just more need to be able to engage with people and talk to them about these changes that are more, help people move through this paradigm shift more quickly. Susan, you want to, for a time.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stay on. Chris and I can stay on for a few minutes and keep answering questions. But knowing that it's 4 o'clock and some of you are off, I want to thank everyone and know that this will be archived and available to you. So with that, let's continue on a few more important questions for those of you that can stay with us. Chris, there was a really great question from LaDonna Spain that says, could you speak further toward the support systems that the district and state agencies put in place to support the schools in transition?
Do you want me to try to talk about that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So, I mean, from the state level, the first big shift is moving from a compliance orientation to a support orientation. So that's just really critical. What New Hampshire has done has been beautiful. They really believe in co-design. So the state doesn't go into a room and decide things for the districts. They, in fact, create room for the districts to come together with people from the state and co-design what's needed to move forward. And in doing that, what we're seeing is some very high-quality initiatives. One has been about building up their capacity around performance-based assessment, building it into their accountability system, and helping to calibrate proficiency, what it means for a student to be proficient in 4th grade math or 8th grade math across districts. And they're doing this all in one initiative because it's so well designed. And so we're really seeing that as a positive step. We're also seeing states work in partnership with intermediaries in a really nice way. So Vermont has worked with Great Schools Partnership to be able to provide some early training. Idaho is doing a pilot model, and they brought in people, Sydney Shea from Redesign, to do the kind of initial discussions around competency-based ed so that everybody they got a good start at understanding it and getting questions answered. So part of this also is being able to create, what we're seeing states do is open up conversations so that issues can come to the top and be resolved. So again, in Maine, there were a number of issues about implementing a proficiency-based diploma, and the folks at the state, both their legislature and their Department of Ed, have taken the time to listen deeply and try to begin to resolve those. So I would say mostly it's operating in partnership. Susan, you want to add anything?
No, that's great. That's great. We got a few more questions too. This is a really good one for you, Chris. It's from Priya from earlier. What about a slow learner who's moving at a slower pace and rate? Is there a time limit for graduation in such a system?
So there's a lot of context for this, right? So what does it mean to be, one of the things we have to be careful of is moving from smart and dumb to fast and slow, right? Because a slow learner doesn't necessarily mean that there's some cognitive problem. So what's causing the slow learning? In most cases, I mean, this is just from talking to people, but my finding is that slow learners are actually learning over substantial number of performance levels. They're missing some prerequisite skills. So take algebra. If you're going to do algebra, you have to learn fractions. You have to know your fractions and understand the concepts of numeracy. If you didn't get that the first time around, you're going to take some time, maybe even a year, year and a half to complete algebra because you're learning all those other prerequisite skills. So you're actually learning, if you look at that, at a very high rate or growth rate of learning. So that's not actually slow learning. That is an extensive kind of distance of learning. What we're seeing a little bit of, not as much as we need, is schools starting to say, well, we've got a lot of kids who need to learn more than just 4 years of growth in high school. What are we going to do? So some are starting to do kind of pre-sessions. If you know the kids are coming in from 8th grade who are missing certain skills, why not do something about that sooner than before they even come into 9th grade? So there's kind of this preemptive effort. And I was just at Juarez Community High School. It's on competency work. And they actually saved some of their budget. So kids who haven't completed what they needed to during the year just come back on Monday after school is over in May or June, and they just come back and they keep working. And then sort of the last option should be extending a whole other year of learning for kids. But that's definitely an option that kids go to a 5th or 6th year.
Thanks, Chris. And I would just...
Anything else, Susan?
Yeah, I would just point out, like, when you look at what the learning sciences say about how students learn, is that learning hinges on prior learning. And so what we might, in a traditional system, observe as a, quote, slow learner, we're finding in these developed competency-based systems with highly personalized learning approaches that once you fill in the gaps for students that have gaps, that their learning can accelerate at a rapid pace and catch up with everyone else who's on pace for graduation. And so a lot of our notions around what's slow and what's fast are still tied to the structures of a certain amount of content each day and an hour. One teacher, one class, 1 hour, 1 day, which sort of leads into the question. But if you think about closing those gaps and the ability to accelerate, I have just been amazed by watching students, once they fill in those gaps, accelerate, making 2 years of progress in a single year. There are some examples of 2 years of progress in 6 months. Now, that raises a whole other set of issues around equity on what's fair to expect for acceleration and growth and pacing. But I think those are the right questions that we want to dig into around how do we think about true equity in a system that is asking and can ensure all students are successful. So a couple more points. Thanks for those of you that are staying through our Q&A. Audrey at Southern New Hampshire University earlier, when we were talking about the platforms to support competency-based, made a great point. They're using Motivus as an information platform. I know VLAX is also using Motivus, so there's another competency-based platform that's out in the field, and Southern New Hampshire was a Next Generation Learning Challenges grantee in the higher ed space, but that Motivus is also being used in K-12 schools as well. There was another question too, Chris, from Jason Sanders, who was asking about building courses. Like, they're moving from traditional courses and blended learning. How do they get started when they think about building new courses that are actually competency-based? We're designing competencies. Like, what are first steps? And I was thinking about the report that you published a few years ago on the art and science of designing competencies. Do you have any advice for people that want to take some first steps in moving from sort of traditional course structures to more competency-based progressions?
Okay, I say this with a word of caution. Obviously teachers can move ahead towards competency-based education, but knowing that we really think it requires the entire school. And the reason is schools have to schedule in extra support to kids. And when teachers try to do it all alone by themselves, it's very hard to provide the additional support. So I just want to say that up front. But if you're a teacher and you're like, I want to get going, so you're going to take your standards and you're going to try to unpack those and really think about what is it I want kids to learn, and be very clear about what how they're going to demonstrate their learning, like what's proficiency. And you're going to create some type of rubric that allows them to know when they're getting closer to that, right, in some sense. Sometimes it's based on depth of knowledge, sometimes it's based on how close they're getting. And then you're going to make that transparent to the kids, and that's a really important step. And then what you want to do in terms of your curriculum is take a step back from however you were delivering curriculum before. And if you've already been doing project-based learning, it won't be as hard. But you want to start to kind of say, how can kids get to this? What can they do to be able to learn this skill or this content? And think about some choices. 2, 3. A lot of choices doesn't help. But give them some opportunities to be able to engage and in learning those skills. And I think those are all important pieces. The other piece is, how are you going to create more transparency and allow your kids to feel responsible for their own education? And the most kind of concrete steps that I've seen are those efforts that create, in like the first couple days in school, you create a shared vision for the classroom, and you create a code of cooperation so the kids start actually supporting each other in their learning. And you also try to think about standard operating procedures so that you can focus more on your personalized kind of approaches to kids, and let kids, they didn't bring the pencil, they should be able to figure that out because of a standard operating procedure. If they're mixed up about the directions, there should be some guidance on the wall about what to do if you're mixed up. And they can ask other kids or other kids who have been successful. If you do use online learning, if you have computers in your classroom, being able to put units up online allows kids to be working at different units pretty easily, and you can begin to differentiate a little bit more easily. Science is harder to do that because of the labs, for sure. So those are just some little pieces of advice. It's a good question, and I will think about how to get a blog up on that.
Other questions, we'll be happy to hit on these main points in our blogs and on Competency Works. One final question, and thanks so much for everybody for staying. Rick asks, before I knew about competency-based education 5 or 6 years ago, I envisioned a system where kids would move from, say, a K-2 building to a 3rd through 5th building to a middle school and high school based on their age. But within those schools, the kid would be studying each subject at their current level. Say a 5th grade student is working on math, his or her strength, at an 8th grade level, and working on English at a 4th grade level, but the student is in 5th grade classroom with age-level peers. Is this happening or something like this?
Yes. We have done better at helping kids who are learning at lower grade levels than their age-based grade. So I'm going to use the language performance level and grade level. So schools are doing better about trying to figure out how to help meet kids where they are in terms of when their performance level is below their grade level. We are seeing some signs of the ceiling being lifted off. So at Lindsay Unified, they might have a kid in middle school. Well, actually, I've been in elementary school, and the kids are doing 1 or 2 grade levels higher in one of their academic classes. Not often all of them, but maybe 1 or 2. Again, it's much easier if there's some online units that kids can take advantage of. But definitely kids are starting to do that, and often sometimes going into the actual classroom with an older grade, but to go into a more advanced course. So the trickiest part seems to be between elementary and the secondary schools. It's when you have nobody in the school knows that next advanced level. And so one of the pushes is definitely, we want teachers to have a deeper understanding of their domain and be able to teach and be familiar with the standards above and below their grade levels. And that's one of the key points that we're seeing a change in.
Thanks, Chris. I would just add to that, this idea of students advancing and lifting off the ceiling it's starting, you're starting to see students be able to continue to move on when they're ready. And when you look at what that means when students are in high school, it's really interesting to see in some models the expansion of dual enrollment, students being able to take courses, even online dual enrollment, starting to earn college credit, graduate from high school with their associate's degree, like early college programs, engage in more advanced placement courses, start to really build in that pipeline into college. And then one last question, and then we are going to sign off. A really good question around the research. Stephen Rugg asked, is anyone aware of any current or recent large-scale evaluation or validation impact research, say extending what was learned from earlier outcomes-based education and mastery learning trials? Like, Chris, there has been some research from the U.S. Department of Ed, the Nellie May Education Foundation has funded some research that AIR has done. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I don't, well, sorry, I actually couldn't hear you, but let me just say quickly, there was some research, I wouldn't call it a full-scale evaluation, around mastery-based learning in the 1980s, which was a classroom model, not a full school model. But Susan, I couldn't hear what research you were referring to.
The Nellie May Education Foundation has funded some research around competency-based education. The research from the 80s, Gusky's
right.
work, and then AIR. Sorry, I didn't say AIR clearly.
Right. Yes, there it is. Okay, so I think there can be lessons learned from outcome-based models from the 1980s and such, but I would not, competency-based ed, the world we live in is so different from that world. Competency-based ed, personalized learning, and online learning, and deeper learning all going together, that's very different than an outcome-based model that was classroom-based and focused on comprehension and memorization. So I don't even look at that research to actually inform us, although it might. But I do think the AIR model, and if you look up AIR on Competency Works, it's called, I believe, Looking Under the Hood, is a very interesting piece of research, very early in competency-based ed, looking more at the practices in the classroom versus, again, not as much focus on what's the implication of these different structures, but it's beginning to illuminate some of the pieces, and again, it really lifts up this issue of student agency being a very powerful change.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining and staying with us today on our webinar on competency-based education, engaging with such terrific questions, and especially like to thank Chris Sturgis. Chris, your expertise is absolutely incredible in this field, and you are providing us with so much research, so many insights. So just a personal thanks from me to you and all of us at iNACOL for the incredible work you're doing in the field and your leadership. So thanks to everyone. Join us on competencyworks.org and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you and good afternoon.
Bye, everybody.